My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade.
Junk science leads to more junk science, leads to death. Let us ponder some examples. The first and clearest example of junk science turning deadly is in the person of Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko was Stalin's dictator of the Soviet Union's Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. He rejected Mendel's theory of genetics. He also rejected Darwin's theory of natural selection, not on the grounds of it being unsupported by evidence, but instead on the grounds of it being, I quote, foreign, impractical, idealistic, and a product of bourgeoisie capitalism, unquote. Lysenko proposed instead that evolution was based on cooperation and group struggle, rather than the bourgeoisie notion of competition between individuals. Therefore, he held to the Lamarckian theory that organisms evolved through the acquisition of traits they needed and used, such as when a giraffe, by stretching its neck to get leaves, actually made its neck lengthen, and that this longer neck was then somehow passed on to its offspring. On this basis of accumulated changes, Lysenko boasted of being able to turn wheat into rye in a few years, to turn spring wheat into summer wheat, and to be able to use the principle of material dialectic to get organisms to cooperate rather than to compete. Scientists who disagreed, or showed insufficient enthusiasm, were sent to jail, gulag, or firing squad. The net result was that Russia, which had been a wheat exporter, went heavily into debt buying wheat from the United States and then went into a famine. Millions died. The second example of junk science turning deadly is more notorious, namely, the race science of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This so-called science proposed that there is a Darwinian competition between breeds of men, which inevitably produces an invariable conflict no peace can solve, that indeed such a peace is not desirable, as it will lead to a degeneration of the breeding stock, and that this competition has brought out higher and lower forms of human life, that is, Untermenschen and Übermenschen, undermen and overmen, the slave races and the master race. The theory concludes from this that one's political loyalties and general worthiness as a human being spring from one's genetic code, not from one's political beliefs, character, or actions. Your skin color is your uniform. The fact that Cassius Clay, a Negro, and Cat Stevens, a Caucasian, are both Mohammedans, whereas Saint Katarina Takawitha, an American Indian, Saint Paul, a Jew, and Saint Justin Martyr, a Greek, and Saint Augustine of Hippo, North African, are all Catholic, is a fact this theory cannot explain and cannot brush aside. Apparently the fact that one's values, virtues, and habits of thought come from one's genes is taken as a given, and the fact that these things come from one's religion, or from parents and culture, is ignored without being addressed. Race science is a crass attempt to solve the paradox of nature versus nurture merely by denying that upbringing and education have any effect on the human animal, and that free will plays no part in one's personality and loyalties. Race science merely decrees nature the sole sovereign of destiny. Nazi race science was junk science that led to the extermination not only of an appalling and astronomical number of Jews and Gypsies, but also of Catholics, who are not a race. Apparently genetics is passed through the Eucharist, according to the wonder science of the left. An aside. Those who believe the Nazis were creatures of the right rather than of the left are using a deliberately misleading classification. Leftists regard all who oppose communism as one party, whether that opposition be from monarchists, republicans, libertarians, anarchists, or totalitarians. Since the National Socialists of Germany, the Fascists of Italy, and the International Socialists of Russia and China use identical means, propaganda and violence, to pursue identical goals, collectivist secular totalitarianism, and differ only in their uniforms and buzzwords, I suggest the debate about classification is fraudulent. To be sure, whether one is a race collectivist who seeks the extermination of all lesser races by the master race, or one is a class collectivist who seeks the liquidation of all bourgeoisie and aristocratic classes by the proletarian class, may seem like a big difference to the twin brothers during their murderous struggles with each other. Well, I am sure the male rhino can tell the difference between a pretty female rhino and a plain Jane rhino as well. To the Christian, who believe God gave us the right to life, liberty, and property, with the concurrent rights of freedom of conscience and the right to self-defense, to these individuals first and foremost, I only care that I have a large bore rifle handy to shoot the rhino as it rampages, pretty or plain. So it is with various forms of leftism. You may debate the Linnaean classification of the various forms of political insanity involved, if you wish. Which side is the devil's party is not under debate, however. Merely count the number of piles of innocent dead bodies in mass graves or cooked in furnaces or unburied. You may use units of tens of thousands per pile for ease of calculation. End of aside. In America, our most famous example of junk science, and our most persistent scientific fraud to date, working far more damage even than the many eco-hoaxes and environmental scares promoted by cultural Marxists, is the Kinsey Report on Human Sexuality, which was used as the intellectual justification for the disaster known as the Sexual Revolution. Kinsey published 2 books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948 and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. He met all criticism of his methods and findings by pretending that the objections were moral and ethical, hence were mere superstition and prejudice. Whereas he was engaging in honest science, the findings were clear, the debate was over. However, these findings were absurd on their face, claiming that 7 out of 10 men had slept with prostitutes, that half of all married men were adulterers, 4 out of 10 males were homosexual, and 1 out of 10 exclusively homosexual, and on and on. Of course, it was soon shown that his sample relied disproportionately on prison inmates, including those jailed for sex offenses, college students, and members of homosexual clubs and associations. The whole thing was junk science from start to finish, and Kinsey's so-called research institute was just a swingers club where the researchers staged orgies and swapped wives. The junk science was again deadly, for the sexual revolution ushered in the abortion cult, which has consumed more innocent blood than ever the Aztecs spilled across the stepped pyramids of Mexico. The junk science of environmental scaremongering has left its death toll as well, when deaths from diseases carried by insects that could be easily and harmlessly killed by DDT continue to mount, when deaths from the poor, freezing in northern Europe, allegedly in civilized nations, when energy costs have been driven up by a jihad against coal and petrol. And, of course, the coal miners who die because atomic energy plants are never more to be erected in America, all suffering preventable deaths due to environmental alarmism. Likewise, automobile injuries and deaths produced by a government-mandated creation of unsafe, lightweight cars to achieve unrealistic and artificial mileage per gallon standards. Such is the flotsam and wreckage of death and disaster left in the wake of junk science. For far too long we have tolerated this deadly, self-imposed blindness, insanity, and hysteria. There are pools, lakes, and oceans of innocent blood on the hands of all these ignoramuses and willfully ignorant cultists who worship science rather than understand science.